Now that we've been through these essential elements required to establish liability under negligence, let's see if we can bring them all together. So the first thing that we need, or requirement number one, is that the defendant must owe the plaintiff a duty of care. Okay. We'll remember that the first way you can owe a duty is for a mandated or an established category. And there were a list of these provided on slide 16. The second way is if we don't have an established category, then there is actually a two-stage test. The first stage involves reasonable foreseeability, and the second stage involves looking at the salient features of the case. And we'll remember that particular test is set out for us on slide 21 and extended in a couple of slides after. Now, I'm not putting the authorities in here. You'll need to do that on your own, but this is going through the core elements. Now, the third way that we can owe a duty of care occurs when there's a piece of advice, right, and that leads to some form of economic loss. So someone loses money as a result of some careless or negligent advice. The first way that this occurs is via direct advice. So by direct advice, we mean that the defendant gave advice directly to the plaintiff. And we have that particular test set out on slide 28. Okay. We'll also and that comes from the particular case of Hedley, Byrne and Heller. We'll also remember that we do have a different test used, and that is where does a duty of care arise for a third party. Okay, when does that occur? And we have a particular answer to that in terms of the test set out on page 30. Okay. Now, in any of those instances, if we establish that we've owed a duty of care under either 1 or 2 or 3A or 3B, then we'll have established that the defendant owed a duty of care and the first requirement of negligence is met. But it doesn't end there. Once we've done that, then we have to establish whether or not the defendant breached the duty. Now, at this point, we turn from case law and we start looking at the provisions of the Civil Liability Act, in particular, Section 9 of the Civil Liability Act. Section 9, subsection 1, sets out 3 key elements for this test. Right? The risk of the harm must be foreseeable, so the risk has to be foreseeable. The risk must be not insignificant, and a reasonable person, right, would have taken precautions. So that's the test that we apply. To work out would a reasonable person have taken precautions, Section 9 subsection 2 has 4 factors to look at. Probability of the harm, the likely seriousness of the harm, the burden of taking precautions, and the social utility of the activity. So what we can see is we have this overarching test of 3 elements under Section 9. The third element, we need to look at 4 factors to determine whether a reasonable person would actually take precautions. This requirement is set out on slide 34, the 3-limbed test, and The factors to determine whether a reasonable person would take precautions are set out on slide 36. Okay, so if we've owed a duty and we've breached the duty, we can then move on to the third requirement, right? So if we don't show we owe a duty, then you can't be negligent. Even if you owe a duty, if you haven't breached that duty, you can't be negligent. Now we need to establish if we have breached the duty, did the breach cause the harm? And that is set out under section 11 of the CLA. What we need to establish is factual causation, which the courts use the but-for test. And we'll remember that's about whether or not the breach of duty physically or actually caused the harm, but for the defendant's carelessness, would the plaintiff have suffered harm? And the answer to that question will tell us whether or not there's factual causation. As well as factual causation, then the harm must be within the scope of liability of the defendant. So the court is going to look whether it's a reasonably foreseeable consequence. Okay, so again, we run into our old friends of the reasonable foreseeable consequence of the defendant's actions. Okay, so if we owe a duty, that duty is breached, and then the breach causes the harm, prima facie, we have a negligent action by the defendant. But we also know that just because we've established it, we can then move on to step number 4, which is to see are any defences available. We have 2 core defences, and they are the voluntary assumption of risk, and the second is contributory negligence. Now you remember that under voluntary assumption of risk, that relieves the defendant of all liability, whereas in contributory negligence, it apportions or divides the harm or the liability for the harm between the defendant and the plaintiff. Okay. Voluntary assumption of risk requires that the plaintiff, the person injured, knew and voluntarily assumed the risk. Now, traditionally, this has been quite hard to make out at common law, to know that someone actually took on the risk and knew that other people wouldn't be liable. Section 14 of the CLA makes this a little bit easier because it says that a plaintiff will be presumed to be aware of an obvious risk, where an obvious risk is one that would have been obvious to a reasonable person in the position of the plaintiff. So Section 14 makes it a bit easier to say that the plaintiff should have been aware of the risk and known about it when they took it on, but you're still going to have to show that the plaintiff took on the risk aware of the legal consequences, which means in reality it's quite difficult to make out still. In contrast to voluntary assumption of risk, contributory negligence doesn't relieve the defendant of all liability. It apportions the liability between the defendant and the plaintiff. We remember from our case of Manley and Alexander that it arises at common law, so common law supports the concept that the plaintiff contributed themselves to the harm through their own negligence. With Section 23 tells us how we will judge whether the plaintiff has been negligent or not, and that this says we use the same standard as we do for the defendant. So it means that we use Section 9, which you'll remember is how we judge whether the defendant has breached their duty. We use the same test. We also covered that if someone is intoxicated, then under section 47 of the CLA, it's presumed that they contributed, that there was contributory negligence under section 47 if they're intoxicated. Of course, that presumption is rebuttable if they didn't know they were, if it wasn't voluntary intoxication, that is, they were drugged, or if that intoxication didn't actually affect the breach of duty. So that's how the components of negligence fit together. We need to first go through the three requirements to establish whether the defendant whether the defendant has been negligent. They need to owe a duty. That duty needs to have been breached. The breach needs to cause the harm. Once we've established negligence on behalf of the defendant, we turn our eyes to the plaintiff and we ask, did the plaintiff voluntarily assume the risk? If they did, then that relieves the defendant of all liability. Or did the plaintiff actually contribute to the negligence? Was there contributory negligence? If there was, then we apportion the harm between the defendant and the plaintiff. So hopefully that little recap helps solidify our understanding of how the law works in this particular area.